That call goes out, and then no less than 2 minutes later, we hear officer down, shots fired.
Listen up, gang. Lucky Gunner has both fantastic content and great prices on ammo. Enjoy the convenience of online purchase and crazy, super fast shipping. Experience why Lucky Gunner is one of our favorite spots on the Gunternet. Get-asp.com/Lucky Gunner. And while you're there, you'll find MagTech ammunition. MagTech is the exclusive range ammo for the active self-protection team, and we are grateful for their commitment to quality and support. You can buy MagTech ammo at the Lucky Gunner link. Remember to tell them that you heard about them on the ASP podcast. Well, alrighty, gang. Welcome back to the Active Self-Protection Podcast. I am yet again your host, Mike Williver, and I remain your favorite former Fed. With us today, a new friend of mine. His name is Austin. Austin is happily married and lives in Nevada. Is that how you say it?
No, absolutely not.
What? How do you say it, Austin?
It's Nevada.
We had this conversation before we hit the record button, folks. It's Nevada. All right. If you say Nevada, it means you're from California and you're skylighting yourself as a person who's bringing terrible politics with them to a beautiful. Actually, Nevada. Never mind. We don't get political here. So Austin is in the security field. I'll let him elaborate on that in a moment. But Austin, thanks so much for writing in and being willing to be on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I say this almost every week, and it's paying off because a lot of you folks are writing in with your stories, your videos, your news articles to share with me, and so we have a wealth of potential guests coming up, and some very exciting. And for me, the most important thing, some different stories. It's not all just I was in a shooting or I was in a, or I got stabbed or whatever. These are very nuanced, detailed things that I think make for great mental reps. And today is a really special one because it's a very different sort of topic, right? So it fascinated me when I read the email. So here we are. So what can I ask, generally speaking, without naming any employers or any place names or any company names, what sort of security are you in? Because there's security in a casino where you're watching cameras and, people like talking to the pit boss and catching cheaters. There's security where you walk around in a security uniform. There's armed, there's unarmed. So tell our guests a little bit more specifically what it is that you do in security and what your background is there.
Yeah, so now I work in a warehouse, actually. So I'm away from where this event happened, but when I was at that place, I was actually unarmed uniform security.
Okay. I think people know what that means, more or less. So you're basically walking around patrolling on foot, probably mostly, and then
Yeah, a lot of dealing with people who are breaking policy or whatever, and we have to get them out or deal with fights and a lot of drunk people.
And you said this was a warehouse setting?
No, so this was at the casino. Here
gotcha,
now
okay.
at my warehouse job, I'm actually the access control officer, so I deal with everybody's badges and specific areas of the warehouse that they can get into and such.
I got you. So in this case, you're still at the hotel casino. So what sort of training, like I know in California, I knew a little bit about security guard setup. You needed a guard card. There was classes you had to take and certification. So is it similar to that in Nevada? Is there like a class you take or a certain level of training you have to undergo to be a security guard? Or they just hire you and give you a flashlight and a badge?
Yeah, so for the hotel that I was at, it was actually all in-house stuff, so you didn't have to be certified through the state. And then the job that I'm at now, I have to be certified. So the state basically takes I think it's like an 8-hour online course, and then you have to test out of it, and then you go get your certification. And then if you want to do the armed side, then you have to take an additional class and get certified and everything like that.
Okay. So as an access control officer, are you armed or unarmed? Just curious.
I'm unarmed.
Okay.
And so before I got into security, I was actually a corrections officer, which in the state of Nevada is post-certified, which is the peace officer standards and testing. So
very good.
I have that certification and that background, and I was kind of I was doing that during COVID, so everything got really crazy, and there were times when you were working 7 16-hour shifts in a row, and it was just a lot. So
Yeah, I bet.
I decided to get out of that and move on to the next thing.
So let me apologize for all sorts of law enforcement all over the country when I say this. Um, CO, correctional officer, correctional deputy, and security guard are three of the sort of maligned jobs that don't get the credit, in my opinion, the credit they deserve. Are there crappy COs and security guards who don't take their job seriously and who have a mustard stain on their uniform shirt and their shirt's half untucked? Yeah, but there's cops like that too. There's deputies like that too. And I think the people who want to professionalize and um, make a sort of better name for those sorts of jobs are good folks. And you strike me like one of those people. I think we need, if you're a cop and you show up to, a call wherever and security is present, I think it behooves you to not be a jerk and not be condescending and treat them with some respect, because frequently these people, are very professional, take their jobs very seriously, and can be a great resource. So just my editorial 2 cents there.
Yeah, I agreed.
So the incident at hand happened when you worked at a hotel casino. So kind of walk us through what you were doing that day, what your duties were, and then how this whole thing kicked off. I think it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, so at the time I was working lost and found, which is just it's just one of those positions that nobody really likes, but every once in a while you kind of get stuck there. And
Every job has that, yeah.
Yeah, it is what it is. So I was working that, and I had actually just finished helping a customer. um, and as soon as they walked away, I don't know, it was maybe 5 minutes later, a call goes out over the radio of a 211 in progress, which nobody's going to know what that means, but it's the California code for robbery. And obviously we're in Nevada, so the first thing I think is, okay, that's weird, because that's not our code. And we had our own section of 10 codes that was closely related to the local PD, just to kind of keep things similar across the board.
Sure.
But nonetheless, we take it seriously. And so the policy was essentially, if a 211 happens, whoever calls it out is supposed to just watch and observe and let the armed security do what they do, and we get a hold of the local police and all that. The money's insured, so it's not worth anybody's life or a gunfight or anything like that.
Right.
So that call goes out, and then no less than 2 minutes later, we hear officer down, shots fired. And so we're like, oh, that's not good.
Right.
And so I was where I was actually on the opposite side of the casino from where the shots fired allegedly happened. So, and I was a corpsman in the Navy, so I kind of went into medical mode. That's just, you go down to the lowest level of training that you have. So that was my first thought. And I actually wear a medical kit on my ankle.
Nice.
So I sprinted across the casino, which is pretty gigantic. And we all, there's, I think, 8 of us at the time. So we all show up on the other side. There's 2 armed security, and then there's the 6 or 7 of us regular security, and then our security manager at the time. And so our security manager tells us to evacuate the casino. And somewhere in the confusion of the radio traffic, when our dispatch called the local PD, he put it out as a active shooter, because at the time we didn't have any other reports of a robbery. And we also didn't have any other reports of anybody being, injured or anything like that.
So let me stop you right there. So at this point, do you know who put out this call for shots fired, officer down?
No, we have no idea.
But it came over your radio.
Yeah, it came over our radio system.
Okay.
And so we evacuate the building to the best of our ability. You would be amazed at how many people don't listen in the face of a bunch of security officers screaming and yelling to leave.
You'd be amazed how not amazed I am by that, but go ahead.
Yeah, we'd had people who were like, oh, well, let me just finish this round of gambling.
I've got a bonus on my slot machine. I can't leave now.
Yeah, exactly. And like taking forever to pull out their tickets. And whatever. So eventually we got everybody out. Um, and I went back to that side because I was still kind of in the medical mode. And I had actually at this point taken my med kit off of my ankle and put it on my arm outside of my clothes,
Mm.
so that I could get to it easier. And I kind of hovered around the two armed security because they were on their way to the last position of where the officer down call had come out.
Okay.
So um, I was gonna be, there to do what I could do.
So sorry,
God bless
people
you.
at home. Oh, only my wife should have to hear that. Poor thing. You were saying?
So I would say that the hotel property is probably about, I don't know, 300 yards maybe wide.
Mm-hmm.
As far as like the actual building goes, and we were on one extreme end of that. So we couldn't figure out where the officer down was allegedly, so everybody's kind of frantically searching for it, and nobody could find it. So at this point, we're thinking that maybe it's a employee or something who got a hold of a radio, got onto our channel, made the call, something like that.
Oh
So
wow.
we're just
Okay.
kind of frantically searching at this point. So I actually gave my tourniquet to the manager because we were still thinking that the officer down was on that side and he didn't have anything with him. So I gave him something. And then I actually sprinted across the campus, which was extremely long.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so I went back and behind the employee entrance and, frantically searching, whatever. And at this point, police had started to show up. And so we had, I want to say there was probably 50 officers, maybe 60 officers from different agencies. So we had our city PD, the bordering city PD, the county, the state. I mean, it was a lot.
Yeah, an officer down call brings all the boys to the yard.
Yeah, it was everybody. And so when they show up, everybody, of course, starts listening a little better. But they were all, tacked out, full battle rattle, had their ARs or shotguns or, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so everything gets crazy and kind of calms down. And as it's calming down, we realize, man, this has to have been a fake call because after, an hour, nobody can find anybody. Nobody's heard any shots. Nobody's really had anything happen. Um, so we're, I don't know, maybe 2 hours into it, and I had gone back to the office to help start looking at security cameras. And one of the armed guards comes in and says that while he was at the door that we were at, he saw a vehicle that was suspicious that had, like, while all of this was going on, it like rolled up to the door and he could see somebody out like looking at him while they were searching, and it stayed there for a couple minutes and then it like sped away really fast. And we're like, oh, that's kind of weird. So we look at that. And we weren't able to get we were able to get a partial plate, I believe. And so we gave that to the police, and a couple days later we find out that, okay, yeah, it was this guy. He's this, the new primary suspect in the case and stuff. And about a week later, they make an arrest on him after finally finding him. And we find out that he had actually hacked into our radio system, and he had a couple of pre-recorded police calls, or radio traffic, I should say, that he had played over our radio to get a response out of us. And so they had made an arrest on him, and come to find out he's actually a disgruntled employee that had it out for us and was trying to scare us, basically.
I was dying to know what possible motive could someone have. In my mind, I'm thinking, well, maybe they want to create havoc in there so they can commit some sort of, theft or or
Mhm.
something like that would make sense in my mind. The old, if you're going to murder someone, calling a fake, crime across town to get all the
Right.
place busy. Don't do that. Anyone listening, don't do that, please. Um, that was my first thought. And then I'm like, or it could just be we had a term for them back east in law enforcement. We called them squirrels. They were the guys who, would put a gumball red light on their dashboard or try to look like the cops, or, buy a disused police Crown Vic or a Caprice with a spotlight and drive around looking. And we called them, they were just squirrely people. If that was my second thought, is maybe he's trying to insinuate himself into law enforcement in some kind of way. But was he a security employee or just another kind of employee?
No, I don't actually remember what department he worked for. I think it was maybe like the housekeeping or like front desk or something like that. Um, and mind you, this is like a major hotel casino. It's very well known in the area.
Right.
And this was in mid-November, late November actually, so closer to Christmas. So very touristy. We had, I mean, probably 50,000 people in this hotel casino at the time.
So I'm not naming any city names, but there was a terrible mass shooting in a city in Nevada back in 2017, I think it was, from a hotel. A guy shot a bunch of people attending a country music concert. I assume your event happened after that event had happened.
It did, yeah, and different city, but definitely something that what came to mind
Yeah.
was like, oh man, I hope this isn't another mass shooting or whatever. And I'm sure that had played into the law enforcement response as well.
Yeah. Uvalde aside, I hope we're still progressing as far as law enforcement goes, responding to active shooters and that sort of thing. It's kind of mixed results, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
most officers and deputies and most training departments and most agencies know the right thing to do and do the right thing most of the time. But those failures are pretty awful. But with that said, I think the first thing I want to point out is it sounds like everyone took it seriously and nobody thought, oh, this is a fluke. Like what'll happen sometimes is it takes a while for the involved officer, security or sworn LE or whatever, to let it sink in that a thing's really happening. But it's best to assume when you get a call that says man with a gun, waving it around, it's best for the officer to assume that's what's happening until proven otherwise, instead of coming at it from sort of a casual, it's probably nothing.
Right.
I'll leave my rifle in the car. I don't need that. I don't want to scare people with a rifle, yada, yada. So it sounds like everyone took it seriously. Was this person convicted of anything? I can only assume the charge would be maybe terroristic threats or filing a false police report, even though he didn't call the police. Or do you know if was he convicted of a crime?
Yeah, there's I can't remember exactly what the statute is, but there is a Nevada revised statute that involves uh excuse me, it involves essentially wasting police resources.
Yeah.
So I think he had that, and then I believe he I don't know exactly if he was convicted of the terroristic threats, but I know there was a conviction. I just don't know exactly what the charges were, but he did spend some time in jail. I don't know if he's still there or not, but
yeah, what a colossal waste of time and resources. I mean,
yeah,
I think it's the charging attorney would be, attorneys love a puzzle. They like to figure out creative stuff to do with the law, but you'd have to get a little creative with that, because what is, you have to ask yourself, what is the crime being committed? What do we charge this person with? So that must have been an interesting sit down with a couple of DAs in your city.
Yeah.
Yeah. I used to complain when I worked for the federal government, to no one in particular, because no one cared, but I would complain to myself sometimes, that the government would do a thing or have something, an operation set up or whatever, and everyone gets there a day in advance. And if you start adding up all the agents' hours used up, the fuel to get someone there, the wear and tear on the car, the hotel rooms, all that stuff, and it's just, the government's just so wasteful when it comes to that sort of thing. But if you think about that in this incident, 50 plus officers over 2 hours, if you add that up, it comes to a lot of the taxpayers' dollars that were wasted. Not to mention, this already, I'm just preaching to the choir at this point. Not to mention all the other people in your city who may have direly needed police services right then and there and didn't get them in a timely fashion because they were tied up with this. So, what a crazy story. What lessons do you feel like can be learned from what happened? Let me ask you that.
Yeah, I think, well, for one, definitely, you know, like you always say, and like Stephanie always says, radically accepting reality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you, I mean, God forbid that was a real, situation. It's kind of one of those things that you either act or somebody dies. Um, and so for me, it was more about, well, let me go help my buddy, and let's get through it before anybody acts, irrationally or does anything crazy or anything like that. So I think being willing to act and being able to accept it for what it is. And then also, I think, especially on a team like that, this is specifically for law enforcement and for security and EMS, whatever. Being on a team like that, you have to know kind of what your responsibility is and be willing to do that and focus mainly on that, and being willing to rely on the people that you work with and your teammates in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Did anything that happened that day have any effect on your procedures or the training where you worked? Did they take any of this into account as far as training you or new employees?
No, not really.
I'm not sure.
I
I'm not
think,
sure what you would change, but other than encrypting your
yeah, I
radios.
think we followed the procedure as much as we could. Um, the problem with a resort like that is that there's, usually the casino on the bottom floor and then the hotel everywhere else. Um, and so when a call like that comes out for the casino floor, getting everybody as far away from the incident without necessarily displacing everybody out of the casino was kind of a problem for us because, like I said, there's thousands of people, um, and you only have so much room to get them out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the police are going to want to talk to them and get statements from everybody and whatnot. So if they leave the building or whatever, then there goes, somebody could have vital information and it could be gone at that point. So it was kind of difficult to get people to a safe place, but be able to hold on to them and keep them for information.
Yeah,
So
witnesses are always tricky that way. Whether it's a scene of an accident or something like you went through, you want to get the people to safety, but you'd also would like for them to hang around to be able to answer questions, which opens up another potential lesson for security and law enforcement is what is your lawful authority to detain someone for questioning who is a witness, and that might vary from state to state, but that's definitely something to consider. You tell someone, hey, I need you to hang out for a few minutes so we can talk to you, and they're like, well, go screw yourself. I'm leaving. I'm going to get a Big Mac. Bye. What do you do? So just something to think about. I think this was a really fascinating story and a great lesson for our listeners. You don't have to be in security or law enforcement to learn a lesson from this. Maybe you're the person sitting at the slot machine when someone in a uniform walks up and says, go, you got to get out of here right now. And you're like, hang on, let me get my sweater and I need to cash this ticket. It's $3.47 and I need to make sure I get this money. Consider your priorities are your safety. So as the person sitting there at the slot machine or at the blackjack table or wherever, or in a changing room at Macy's for that matter, if they're telling you got to go right now, that means go right now. That means you have to radically and rapidly accept reality. Something's going on, take their word for it and act. So with that said, Austin, I really appreciate you writing in and coming on the show. I really appreciate your story and you taking the time out of your day.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was good to be here.
Thanks again. Folks, stick around for the Gutowski Files. And if you haven't already, go to your podcast provider and find the review section and leave us a 5-star review and say something nice about me and my guest, Austin. Austin, thanks again. Well, alrighty, folks, welcome back to the Gutowski Files, starring Stephen Gutowski. He is the founder of TheReload.com and the host of the Weekly Reload podcast. Speaking of the Weekly Reload podcast, every week.
The what now?
I have a mini stroke at the beginning of Gutowski Files. I don't know why. Probably should get that checked out. Who was on the podcast this week, sir?
We had Kai Klepfer, who is the founder and CEO of BioFire, which is this new smart gun company that people may have heard of, which is bringing their first biometrically enabled firearm to market this year. They've already run out of pre-sales and they're shipping by the end of this year. So we had him on to talk about the gun, lots of questions about the reliability, the security, things that everyone talks about when it comes to these sort of guns that have integrated electronic locking mechanisms in them. But we also, of course, talked about the politics of it, because that's a big thing too. Mandates surrounding smart guns, and even Kai's involvement in the lawsuit to try and get rid of California's handgun roster. So it's pretty wide-ranging conversation.
Very interesting. So check that out over at The Reload or on YouTube. Are there any other platforms? I guess YouTube, over at thereload.com, and then I guess Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the other usual places.
Yeah, it's on all of them. That's one of the nice things about the podcasting distribution, is that you really just, you put it on a host and it sends it out to every single app. So any podcasting app, you could just search for the Weekly Reload podcast and you'll find it. Same for this podcast, right?
Very good. Yes, absolutely. And you mentioned politics a moment ago. So speaking of politics, Stephen and I spoke for a few minutes before we hit the record button to decide if we're going to talk about this and how we're going to talk about this. Because as you know, we try to eschew political stuff on the show, only as it relates to the Second Amendment and your ability to own a firearm. Do we generally stray into that area? But this week, we kind of have to talk about this. As we record this, it is Tuesday, June 20th, and this morning there was an announcement. Stephen, tell us what announcement was made and by whom.
Yeah, and this is a pretty relevant thing that I think a lot of people may have already heard about. If not, they're going to. It's Hunter Biden, President Biden's son, has struck a deal with federal prosecutors to plead guilty to 2 misdemeanor charges involving tax fraud, I believe, and then also has struck a deal to enter pretrial diversion program for a felony charge related to his 2018 purchase of a Colt revolver while he was addicted to drugs. And so that obviously the second part of that is what we find to be newsworthy into the gun community here, because the details of this deal, and then also because of all the political fallout surrounding it.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things we talked about before was, I think you asked me, like, what are the odds, or we talked about what are the odds of just a regular person, let's say someone who uses recreational marijuana, who gets caught owning a firearm, being charged by the feds with this. And it was never my wheelhouse per se. I dealt mainly with immigration and customs related stuff, dope, gangs, that sort of thing. But I dare say I doubt this would have been charged if he was any just regular person out there in the world. What are your thoughts?
I know it's interesting, right? Certainly. So I talked to Drew Stevenson, who's a professor that has studied this specific crime, right? This possession of firearms while being a user or addicted to a controlled substance or an illegal drug. And it is very rare to see a conviction where that is the only charge. Usually, from what the professor said, this is a tack-on crime. It's something that you add to a list of other charges, and perhaps you use it in lieu of something that's harder to prove. In certain cases, right? That's my understanding of how this normally gets used, and that it's not very common to see it as a standalone. Where he said there's about 200 convictions a year was his estimate for how often you see this crime end in being the only conviction when brought against somebody. So in that sense, it's probably fairly uncommon, something like this. Although this isn't a conviction, right? What Hunter Biden has ended up with here, he's got a pretrial diversion program. So Hunter Biden, it's difficult to talk about him because I think one of the things that when people look at him and see a sort of privilege, or that he's getting away with stuff that normal people might not get away with, they there was all this leaks of his from his laptop, where these pictures of him doing a bunch of illegal things and with prostitutes and drug use, and there's all this stuff, and he's not been prosecuted for any of that. This is sort of the closest to that. And then there's also these foreign countries that he had business dealings with, and there's concerns over how he filed his taxes in regards to that. That's what this other deal is about. But there's sort of an impression that there's pictures and video of him doing a lot of illegal things, and he hasn't been charged with all of those things. And so instead he has this deal now. And one of the things involved with it is the only drug related thing is this gun charge. But at the same time, this gun charge is not something that you actually see very often. And he doesn't have a record, right? He might have all that pictures and videos and stuff, but he doesn't have a conviction on his record. And so a pretrial diversion program like this is probably not that unusual for somebody facing this kind of charge in this situation, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. It does. I mean, I feel like, when I was a kid, the embarrassment of the presidential family was like Billy Carter, who had Billy Beer. That was a big controversy, and now we've got a guy who's taking pictures of himself, doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Hey, bad guys, by the way, listen up. Not just Hunter Biden, but just, people in general. If you're going to do illegal stuff, if you're going to smoke crack and hang out with prostitutes, think about not taking pictures of yourself doing it. That's a possibility, because you wouldn't believe how many people on parole and probation, gang members, you name it. We would do a search warrant and they would just have all these pictures. They don't always post them to social media, although they do that too sometimes. Just pictures of them doing all kinds of crazy stuff. So if any bad guys are listening,
to be fair, at least I guess Hunter didn't post these pictures.
Right.
They were part of that laptop that he abandoned, I guess, at a laptop repair store, and that got into the press via that mechanism. So, I mean, I guess he didn't intentionally publicize it. However,
right,
he did write a book that detailed all of his drug use during this period where he bought this gun. So you had all the pictures and videos and stuff that came off of his laptop, but you also had his book. He wrote a whole book, a whole tell-all book, where he claimed that he was using crack every 15 minutes. Obviously, I'm sure that's a bit of an exaggeration, but you get the point. He was he himself was doing media tours about this book that he'd written, where he says, hey, I did this. I did a bunch of crimes and I was on drugs when I bought this gun. So I would imagine that probably put pressure on these prosecutors to take this case more seriously than they might if it was just some other guy. Now, there's also, when you say some other guy or regular person, I would say that a regular person in the same income bracket as Hunter Biden might maybe not have faced these kinds of charges. Now, somebody in a lower income bracket might have, even though, it's not a super common thing to be a standalone crime. So there's a lot going on here, right? You could look at it a couple of different ways. It just depends on your perspective, I guess. Either you could look at it as one way and say, this is happening because he's a public figure, he's a political figure, he's the president's son. It got more scrutiny. He went out there and brought more attention to it himself too.
He wrote a book called "Sorry I Smoked Crack a Whole Bunch of Times" by Hunter Biden.
Yeah,
so
when I had a gun, right? He didn't connect the two things, but the time period he's talking about in that book is this time period when he had this gun, and of course the gun. It's a very crazy story, right? Because he got the gun, then his girlfriend at the time, who was his brother's widow, found the gun, was upset, was worried about, I guess, Hunter harming himself. And so she threw the gun away in a trash can behind a grocery store.
Don't do that, by the way.
Which then was found by somebody who was rooting through the trash, apparently to find recyclable items and pick them out. Then was turned over to the Delaware police, and then the Secret Service got involved and tried to take the background check forms according to Politico. That's what the owner of the gun store where the gun was bought said. The gun store owner refused to give them the background checks because they're not sort of authorized to take them.
Right.
Gave them to the ATF instead. So it's a pretty bizarre story all around how this came to be. But yes, it ends in this deal where there's also an interesting point about the deal he struck too. I think is not only so he's avoiding prison's time.
Mm-hmm.
One, that's an important point because I think a lot of people there's going to be criticism over that. Right? He's done this stuff. He's copped a deal, no prison time. But one of the things that he's agreed to as part of this pretrial diversion program for the gun charge is one, he can't use drugs for 24 months, which seems like a fairly obvious and common requirement, you would think, for a pretrial diversion program
right.
based on this charge. But also, he can't own guns ever again. According to the New York Times, that's one of the conditions of this deal. So he's not going to be a convicted felon, but he's going to have his right to own a gun taken away for life as though he were a convicted felon. So that's another interesting thing I'd never really heard of as a plea deal or a bargain like this that should be considered as well.
Yeah. So to be clear to everyone listening, if you don't understand the concept of diversion, the idea of diversion started as a way usually to help younger defendants, people who were kind of their first time in the system. And I'm a fan of avoiding putting especially young people in jail unnecessarily because it tends to make them better criminals. So the idea of diversion is we get a 19-year-old kid who got caught with whatever nonviolent crime, and to avoid making him a better criminal, we make an attempt before he's charged with whatever crime, we make an attempt to divert him from being in the system. So they go to counseling, they take classes, they do whatever in an effort to avoid making him a cog in that giant criminal justice machine. I'm a fan of this, by the way. It works sometimes. It doesn't always work. Not sure why Hunter Biden would get this, but then again, as Stephen said earlier, he doesn't have any criminal convictions, so technically this is his first offense. So
that's why it doesn't seem that outside of the ordinary. Yeah, obviously there's been criticism out there already where people note that the punishment for this crime is potentially 10 years in federal prison.
Right.
But of course, that's not what most people would actually get if they were charged with this crime. We've already discussed that this doesn't really get pursued as a standalone crime almost at all. And secondly, if you were convicted of it, like a pretrial diversion program for somebody on their first offense is probably not that uncommon, I would think.
No, I don't imagine it is. I mean, I know from my experience, it's not uncommon at all. But again, not my wheelhouse, not my bailiwick necessarily.
Yeah, of course, the politics of this is all scrambled, right? Because It's the president's son, and it's the president himself is a staunch gun control advocate, right? He's actively made our gun laws more restrictive since he's been in office, right? And under his direction, the ATF is still telling everyone that they will enforce this exact prohibition, right? In regards to, there was just recently, I think it was Minnesota, decriminalized marijuana possession. And the ATF put out a statement earlier this month, that said, doesn't matter what Minnesota says, federal law still says that you can't use marijuana and own a gun. So we will continue to enforce that prohibition. And so, you have the politics of that involved in all this too. And so you have actually gun rights organizations. You have the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, which is like a sister group to the Second Amendment Foundation, have criticized this deal. You've seen the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the gun industry's trade group, come out and criticize the deal, basically accusing the Biden administration of hypocrisy because Hunter is getting off with this no jail time deal while they're trying to tighten gun restrictions for everyone else.
They're not wrong.
Sort of the argument that's being used out there. Then at the same time, the other thing that this deal prevents is Hunter Biden himself potentially using the Second Amendment as a defense in court, right? Because what we've seen over the last year since the Supreme Court handed down Bruin, that landmark decision, there have actually been multiple rulings in federal court that say this prohibition that Biden is charged under is unconstitutional. This lifetime ban doesn't fit with the history and tradition of gun regulation in the United States, especially from the founding era. And so you've got a case out of Texas and a case out of Oklahoma where these exact charges that Biden is going through pretrial diversion program for are unconstitutional. So, and there was a report in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago that said he was going to use that same defense if this had gone to court. And actually, to be fair, it still could go to court. Like, this is a pretrial diversion.
Yeah.
It's like probation. If he violates it, he could still end up being charged with this down the line.
Absolutely. Was there anything else you wanted to touch on about this story, Steve?
No, I mean, there's so much there. It's a fascinating thing. I actually think we're going to cover more of it on the Weekly Reload podcast in the next episode here. We can bring in a lawyer who deals with federal law and go through all the details of this in that. So if people want to hear a more in-depth discussion of it, they can check that out when it comes out Sunday for members and Monday for everyone else.
Check it out, thereload.com on YouTube and all your major podcasting outlets. If you are lamenting the lack of sane, sober, down-the-middle reporting on the Second Amendment and all things gun-related, do me a favor, go over to thereload.com. That's thereload.com and consider getting a membership. Stephen relies on your membership dues to fund his important work, and near as I can tell, nobody else is doing what he's doing over there. Stephen, I will see you next week, and as always, sir, you have the last word.
Absolutely. Although, someone finally noticed that we've been doing this running joke that absolutely is always the last word here.
Okay. So. As soon as I hit the end button, I need to know who that was exactly, because I'm curious to know.
So somebody caught it finally.
Okay,
good job.
All right. Well, we're not gonna stop doing it, folks. Can't stop, won't stop. Stephen has the last word every week, and he said it already. He's gonna say it again.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Oh.